The movie Scarface, starring Al Pacino, is one of the most famous examples of an anti-hero in cinema. While the character of Tony Montana appealed to many due to his charismatic tough guy persona that seems nearly unbreakable throughout the duration of the film, many of the same traits that led to Tony Montana's success are also the cause of his own downfall. Let's first of all start by understanding who the character of Tony Montana is based off of in the first place. Tony Montana is patterned after Cesar Al Capone, a notorious 1920s and 1930s racketeer pimp bootleg. He is perhaps the most famous gangster in the United States, being a Prohibition-era gangster who dominated organized crime from 1925 to 1931. Since Capone lived a life of crime, he was no stranger to recurring violent incidents. Before he turned 21, he had been slashed with a knife or razor on his left cheek by a young hoodlum named Frank Galluccio after Capone made a rude comment to his sister. This is where the nickname Scarface comes from.
How am I gonna get a scar like that eating pussy?
The 1983 film is a remake of the 1932 film with some notable differences. That being the name of the character, as his name is Tony Camonte, and he is an Italian immigrant instead of a Cuban one. There are many similarities between these two characters, but it's important to understand at least the basics of the inspiration for the character in film for the context of this analysis. While Scarface is heavily inspired by the life and crimes of Cesar Al Capone, Scarface is not based on true events. Note that before this analysis, these are just assumptions backed up by evidence through Tony Montana's characterization and interpretation of the film. I will simply be describing how Tony exhibits the traits of sociopathy and antisocial personality disorder using the clues, characterization, and context that we have of the character and his behavior. Without further ado, let's look more directly into Tony Montana's psyche throughout the film, Scarface. Tony starts off as a Cuban refugee trying to make a living for himself in the United States, specifically Miami, which of course is in Florida, roughly 90 miles away from Cuba. There are a couple things to notice about Tony Montana's character from the interrogation scene right off the bat. Tony seems like a calm and confident individual most of the time. However, when he has to step up or be more assertive to get what he wants, he has no problem doing so. Tony is a very upfront and very disagreeable character. After being asked a bunch of weird questions,
You like men, huh?
What the fuck is wrong with this guy? Am I kidding me or what?
he throws a fit when he's sent by interrogation officers to a detention camp, ironically called Freedom Town. From the very get-go, we get to see Tony's negotiation skills. Being disagreeable is one of the most important qualities that makes Tony a briefly successful gangster and drug kingpin. Disagreeable people tend to be more successful when it comes to negotiations in business. As we see throughout the film Tony rise through the ranks, his negotiation skills are noticeably one of the strongest things about him. Tony stands his ground and sucks up to nobody, saying the iconic line,
All I have in this world is my balls and my word, and I don't break them for no one. Do you understand?
After Manny introduces his friend Omar and Waldo, who have direct connections to the cartel, Tony is persuaded into a job working for them, where he can make about $5,000. Tony feels belittled working as a dishwasher, barely making a living, and feels especially disrespected when Omar points out his job, almost getting into a physical altercation with him. This is when we see him quit his dishwashing job on the spot alongside Manny, as Tony desperately wants something greater. Tony is also seen to have a strained relationship with his mother, but a close relationship with his sister. When Tony revisits his mother at her house for the first time in years, he seemingly tries to buy his mother's respect back, as stated by her character. Tony's mother immediately catches on to Tony's ploy and denies her son's dirty money. She also threatens Tony, trying to protect his sister from his life of crime. There's a strange relationship between Tony and his sister within the film. It is almost implied that Tony wants to have a sexual relationship with his sister toward the end of the film, as his sister is high off of drugs, and insinuates that he has sexual feelings for her by saying, "Fuck me, Tony," repeatedly while shooting at him. I think, however, that this is extremely misleading, and it is only her in this drug-induced state that thinks that this is the reason why Tony is overprotective. Tony is extremely overprotective of his sister because he doesn't want her to get mixed up in his life of crime. The scene when Tony enters the mansion and sees his best friend Manny with his sister just shows how strongly he feels about her, as he shoots his best friend without hesitation. Tony sees this as a betrayal by his best friends, however ridiculous that may sound, but it shows how strongly he is willing to protect his sister from this life of crime. Manny was a part of the same life of crime that he was, and ultimately, Manny dating his sister would have brought her into that life of crime by association. Unfortunately, his efforts to separate her from his life of crime are unsuccessful by the end of the film. This is ironic considering how Tony spoiled his sister with dirty money that he gained from operating within the cartel. Tony Montana is an anti-hero down to the bone, who likely has undiagnosed antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder are entitlement, a sense of self-importance, arrogance, and preoccupation with power, beauty, or success. Tony displays each of these traits throughout the film, always negotiating ruthlessly to make sure he gets what he wants. Antisocial personality disorder typically exhibits aggression, recklessness, irresponsibility, and criminal behaviors, or behaviors that are socially negative. Antisocial is not to be confused with asocial, which is behavior that displays an avoidance of social interaction. For narcissistic personality disorder, the first example is Tony's general arrogance. This arrogance is one of the things that ends up getting him killed in the film, as he doesn't stop to think about making a deal with Alejandro Sosa behind Frank Lopez's back. This is what drives Frank to hire a hit on Tony, which is ultimately unsuccessful. However, even after Tony murders Frank, Tony's arrogance and drive for power continues when he is berated over the phone by Sosa for not carrying out the hit that he's supposed to carry out. Sosa reveals over the phone that the car bomb that was supposed to be used to assassinate a journalist that was going to expose Sosa and his business had been found. Sosa says that the journalist had security up the ass, making it virtually impossible for them to carry out another hit. Although Tony had an ethical reason for not carrying out the hit, that being the inclusion of children being involved, he compromised directions from his superior, the one who gave him all the money. Tony's arrogance stems from his own ego, as well as his success up until this point in the film. He is now rich and he's now more powerful. His arrogance as well as his ego gets the best of him, and in a drug-induced state, he says that he will willingly go to war with Sosa. This causes Sosa to send a huge hit squad, which ultimately leads to Tony's demise. Another example is when Tony meets Frank's girlfriend, Elvira Hancock. He instantly takes a liking to her and tries to win her over. Taking a liking to your boss's girlfriend, especially when in a business as dangerous as the drug cartel, doesn't necessarily seem like the best idea. Luckily for Tony, she's a gold digger. Tony's entitlement starts to show, however, as he is so intent on winning Elvira over that he even attempts to openly flirt with her in front of Frank, disrespecting him. This in fact may have been one of the contributing reasons why Frank put a hit on Tony, with the main being Tony making the business deal with Alejandro Sosa behind his back. There are multiple times in the film where Tony attempts to seduce Elvira, with the most upfront one being when Tony approaches her outside sitting in the sun and tells her that he wants her to be the mother of his children, which is pretty bold if you ask me. This leads to one of the next traits, which is his preoccupation with power, beauty, and success. Tony doesn't seem to love Elvira, rather he seems more infatuated by her beauty, treating her more like a trophy rather than a wife. This is also proven further by her characterization and hollow personality. She doesn't have much of a personality other than acting bitchy and bratty throughout the entire film. She clearly is only around for the money, but even when she has it to her disposal, she complains, constantly asking for more. Her tone is almost always sarcastic, and there aren't necessarily any moments where she shows any depth of character. She doesn't seem fazed after her husband dies, jumping to the next wealthy man who can help her fund her drug habits and luxurious lifestyle. There is even a ridiculous scene where a painting of Tony and Elvira is unveiled after they get married. Tony seems in love with Elvira in the film, however it never seems to be for her character, rather he sees her as the archetypical trophy wife, a beautiful accessory that Tony can have next to him at all times. Symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, on the other hand, also include a multitude of things shown within the film, including Tony's ability to act witty and charming, his problems with substance abuse, disregard for the safety of himself and others, lying, fighting or stealing, breaking the law repeatedly, being good at flattering or manipulating other people's emotions, and being constantly angry and arrogant. It's safe to say that he checks out all these boxes, and so do many other criminals in the drug underworld. There are points in the film where Tony is able to charm, whether it be other gangsters, friends, or even Elvira. One thing that I almost forgot to mention is Tony's aggressive demeanor. I think casting Al Pacino was the perfect decision, as not only does he give the role its character and bring it to life, but it's in the subtle ways as well. Tony has a noticeably shorter stature compared to many other gangsters in the film. It is his aggressive and fearless demeanor that commands respect, despite the setback. This angry demeanor, combined with Tony's arrogance, make him successful when it comes to rising up the ranks quickly, but vulnerable to his own ego and decision-making. Of course, breaking the law repeatedly is a prime symptom of this disorder, and Tony does this as a drug kingpin throughout the film, while also disregarding the safety of others. However, Tony isn't a complete psychopath, as he exhibits empathy in the film when he chooses not to carry out the hit Sosa wanted him to carry out, as children were involved. It makes more sense to classify him as a sociopath, as his ability to rise up the ranks and his antisocial tendencies make perfect sense within the context of the film. We see just how reckless Tony is, his angry and arrogant attitude, and his charming demeanor, which gives him the ability to move people around like a pawn. Of course, we have to mention Tony's severe cocaine addiction. Both Tony and Elvira are drug addicts, however, Tony's cocaine addiction gets a little bit out of hand at times, so out of hand that the people around him start to look at him differently. Towards the end of the film, there's a scene where he's in almost complete isolation as he realizes he's about to receive a hit from Alejandro Sosa. With only 2 of his henchmen left by his side, he starts snorting an absurd amount of cocaine. This honestly is peak cinema right here. We see just how reckless Tony is at the end of the film, which portrays him so high off of cocaine and power that he's screaming at the guy shooting at him with petty insults after getting shot multiple times. The amount of adrenaline and cocaine flowing through his body is so much that he is still standing. I think this scene represents the climax of Tony's ego, and ultimately it is his ego that kills him, as after this Tony is murdered from behind while distracted. His ego mixed with a life of crime was a dangerous combo to begin with, as it led to him burning bridges that would lead to his eventual demise. Ultimately, Tony Montana flew too close to the sun and went out with a bang. While Tony Montana is a famous example of an anti-hero, of course he isn't the type of person one should admire or even look up to. Our culture seems infatuated with anti-heroes for good reason. They are entertaining to witness on screen as they are flawed like us, representing the most suppressed parts of our own shadow. The parts we like about a character like Tony Montana are his fearlessness and charisma, his ability to beat all the odds, even with the cards that he was given. Scarface is a story about ambition being in the wrong hands, with the point of the film being that a life of crime eventually catches up to you. Although we are fascinated and sometimes even glamorize a life of crime in things such as music and cinema, Scarface seems to glamorize this life of crime in an almost psychedelic type of way, until it comes completely crashing down. Tony's willing to do whatever it takes to get what he wants. However, he doesn't realize the consequences of his actions until they come crashing down on him, de-glamorizing what we think a successful life of crime looks like. In fact, we see the 2 sides of the film, the rich and glamorous side and the gory and tragic side, with the amount of death and violence that surrounds our main character. This was the psychology behind Tony Montana, also known as Scarface. If you enjoyed this video essay, leave a like, comment, and subscribe, as it helps push this video into the algorithm and helps me make more videos for the channel. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and until then, I'm Technical Difficulties. Please stand by.